The PEF, as some of you will know, was established in 1865 for the academic study of and exploration of the southern Levant, and it is the world's oldest society for the study of this region. We pioneered the fields of geography, ancient history, archaeology and architecture, and ethnography, and the use of photography as a tool of study and record. The subject of tonight's talk is one which was a concern of the PEF's right from the beginning, but not for the usual reasons. Rather than reporting on the interesting discoveries being made in Jerusalem by Montague Parker, 5th Earl of Morley, and his motley crew of adventurers and scryers, we printed disclaimers in our journal, the Quarterly Statement, attempting to put as much distance between us and this expedition as possible, as we had been mistakenly assumed to be involved in the project. So what was it all about? Why was it such a scandalous undertaking? I'm sure that tonight's speaker, Graham Addison, here, author of a fantastic book called Raiders of the Hidden Ark, the story of the Parker expedition to Jerusalem, will tell us all and more. Over to you, Graham.
Thank you very much. And in fact, on one of the slides I have a letter from the Honorary Secretary of the PEF to the Times, making it very clear that they had absolutely nothing to do with it at all and decrying the whole adventure. Anyway, so thank you very much, Felicity, for the introduction. I first read about this story when I read Simon Sebag Montefiore's book about Jerusalem, which is obviously sort of about that thick for anyone who's read it. Covers millennia, but in there were about 4 or 5 pages about the Parker expedition, and I thought it was so crazy. These upper-class Englishmen going off to Jerusalem where they knew nothing about it, looking for hidden treasures, bribing officials, causing riots, disorder, scandal, and it was just such a bizarre thing that I thought I should look into it and see if there was more information, and there was very little. But I decided I wanted to write a book about it, so decided to go into researching it and have, as a result, as Felicity said, written a book about it. So, the oddest archaeologists ever to visit Jerusalem. It's not my quote. This is a quote from Bertha Spafford-Vester, who was a very long-term resident of Jerusalem, member of the American colony, somewhat misnamed because there are actually lots of Swedes and lots of Europeans in it, but it was a very, very influential organization within Jerusalem, and she was a very influential member of the community in Jerusalem. And as you see here, she says, well, they were certainly the oddest. They met them and found them very charming, but were completely puzzled by their lack of archaeological expertise, because this was at the time one of the largest archaeological expeditions to Jerusalem. It was enormous, and I'll go into a bit more detail about the scale of it. So what I wanted to cover was why did they go to Jerusalem, who was on the expedition, what did they actually do there, because there's lots of myths and apprehensions about the expedition. Were there any archaeological finds of value, and are there any implications, or were there any impacts on Jerusalem of the expedition? So the first thing to say is, yes, they were looking for the Ark of the Covenant. They always denied it, and this is a bit where they were the first people who actually went looking for the Ark of the Covenant, to my knowledge. And this document here is taken from the cipher workings which started the whole thing of this biblical scholar called Walter Jubilius. And this is a translation that you see here. They're looking for the Ark of the Covenant and the archive of the temple. And this was like, let's call it his sales pitch to investors to help him raise the money to go and find the Ark of the Covenant in Jerusalem. The Ark of the Covenant, probably don't need to go into that too much. The Bible is our only source of information on the Ark of the Covenant, but constructed to hold the 10 Commandments, became a sort of totem pole, a rallying place for the Israelites on their exile. Very deadly, lots of people, it killed lots of people. Famously, of course, Jericho, the walls of Jericho. The Ark was paraded around it on 7 days by 7 priests with 7 horns. And at the end of that, the walls came tumbling down. Or perhaps not, according to the archaeological evidence, but anyway. But this is what meant that they wanted to find the ark. They thought it was fantastically powerful. So who was on the expedition? And this is the classic photo or image of the expedition. And I'd love to know if anyone knows Jerusalem, where this was taken. It was taken in Jerusalem in 1909, and these are the members of the expedition, or most of them, and some of the Ottoman officials who were around it. But the one person who is missing, or one of the people who is missing from it, is the one who started it all, which is Walter Juvelius. And lots of things, when newspaper reports were written about it, was who was he? Was he a Finn? Was he Danish? He was a biblical scholar. How did he get this information? So he was Finnish, and at that time Finland was part of the Russian Empire. Lived quite close to St. Petersburg. He was originally a surveyor, which was his father's profession, but he was also a poet and translator, and so he composed a poem which is still very well known in Finland. But he decided partway through his life to give up his career as a surveyor and study for a doctorate at the Finnish Imperial University, where he studied his dissertation was on the chronology of the Old Testament. And whilst he was making these studies, he said that he found secret ciphers hidden in the Bible. Now, many people have claimed that, but he, in terms of what he claimed, was the most prodigious finder of ciphers within the Bible. So he put together all of the information, a long document, if you like, let's call it a sales prospectus, and tried to interest people in the expedition. This is an example of his ciphers. Again, this is one of the original documents. So it is in Swedish, so if anyone reads Swedish, it's fine, but I'll give you some translations. As I said, he found an enormous number of hidden messages within the Bible, or claimed to have. So he found them in the book of Ezekiel, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, the Wisdom of Sirach, which is sometimes known as Ecclesiasticus, and there were over 40 ciphers that he found, or claimed to have found, within his first work. And they were all based on a numerical cipher using the number 7. The 7 is considered a holy or number in the Bible. Obviously, according to the Bible, God created the world in 6 days and then rested on the 7th. As I mentioned, in terms of the walls of Jericho, the priests went round 7 times. The ark was put in the temple on the 7th month of the year. So 7 is a very important number. If you get to the book of Revelations, 7 seals, 7 churches, 777, it is considered a very holy or special number. So what his cipher, how it worked, is you took a sentence, you took the first letter of the first word, counted 1 forward, the first letter of the next word, counted 2, took the first letter of that word, counted 3 words, first letter of that, etc., etc. And of course it only worked in the biblical Hebrew because that had to be what obviously the scholars and scribes were writing it in. It couldn't be read in a translated version. Anyway, that's what he said it worked. When I was writing the book, after I'd finished writing the book, I exchanged information with Professor Ronnie Reich, who's an emeritus professor of archaeology in Israel. And I sent him some of these and some of the documents around it. He said, they're just complete nonsense. But anyway, that didn't stop the people investing in this. So all of the messages were very cryptic. So here we have, this is what read here, which is the cross. There is a stairway of the hall, 62 spear lengths, 12 measuring lines, blood. And all of the things were very, very similar, very cryptic, very, they weren't a treasure map with X marks the cross or X marks the spot. Although in occasional parts, you did have an X marking the spot. And that was around, and he fixed on the chambers, the water systems, that Sir Charles Warren and the PEF had explored 50 years before. And so here you can just see Warren's Tunnel, Siloam. So he believed that this was where the Ark and the temple treasures were hidden. And that's what he then tried to get people interested in terms of finding the Ark. Bizarrely, and obviously on the 100th anniversary of Tutankhamun, and we all know about Tutankhamun's curse, which was probably a newspaper invention after it, but Juvelius actually said there was a curse in his ciphers, and that anyone who tried to find the treasure house would be cursed 6 and 60-fold. So it's ironic that he believed that people who were finding it were going to be cursed. But anyway. So he tried originally to raise money in Finland, but Finland's a fairly small country. He didn't succeed. So through a contact, he had a friend, Johan Millen, who was a businessman, and he came to London to try and raise the funds. And obviously at the time, London, the centre of the greatest empire in the world, the richest city in the world, and Millen tried to raise the funds. So he approached several newspapers, the Daily Mail, the London Standard, and one of those he was in contact with an author and a journalist called William LeQue, who is a fantastic and interesting character in his own right. He was the inventor almost of spy fiction, and invasion fiction, and wrote over 200 books, and can legitimately be claimed to be the person who drove the creation of British intelligence in terms of the government setting up a British intelligence agency before the First World War. Unfortunately, he took a little too long, or the newspapers took a little too long to come up with the funding, and so Millen then made contact with Montague Parker. But all was not lost for LeQue, because he realised a good thing when he saw it and wrote a best-selling book as a result. Using all of the ciphers, it became a bestseller in the UK, in America, called The Treasure of Israel, and you can actually buy it, and it has a lot of the information of the ciphers, slightly modified, but of the cipher work of Juvelius. However, as I mentioned, Millen met Parker. So Parker came from a very aristocratic family. These photos are of his ancestral pile. This is Saltram House, which is down in Plymouth, and this is where Parker lived, or his family lived. He was the second son of the 3rd Earl of Morley, and as Felicity mentioned, he later became the 5th Earl Morley. He was Eton educated, and after Eton he joined the Grenadier Guards. He was one of the youngest officers to go and fight in the Boer War, and there are several themes of people who went on the expedition. One is Eton and one is the Boer War. He was wounded in the Boer War, but he was interested in this, and he said, right, well, let's go and set up this syndicate. And the syndicate was called JMPFV, so Juvelius, Millen, Parker, Fort and Vaughan. Fort and Vaughan are not so interesting. Vaughan went bankrupt shortly afterwards, and so they played very limited role in this. So, in 1908, Parker went off, they raised the fund, or rather they put in the funds themselves, about £6,000 of capital, and Parker went off to Constantinople in November 1908. This roughly coincided with, obviously, the Young Turk Revolution and a general election that took place immediately following that. So there was a general election all across the Ottoman Empire of the time. Parker set himself up in the best hotel in Constantinople, the Pera Palace Hotel, and wrote to the finance minister saying that he had found after long research, not that Parker did a lot of that, but long research, they had found a very important treasure in the Ottoman Empire. He used all his connections, his establishment connections. He listed that he was an officer in the Grenadier Guards, that his father was a former minister in government. And he also got the Ottomans interested because he told them how much he thought that it was worth. Now, I have no idea how they came up with this figure, but they estimated that the treasures were worth £40 million in 1908, which corresponds to over £5 billion today. fantastic number, but how do you value the Ark of the Covenant? But this was the figure they put on it, and they said to the Ottoman government, we will split that 50-50 with you. The Ottoman government at the time was famous for being always short of money. They had terrible financial problems. Sounds a bit like the UK today, but they were absolutely usually broke, and so they were very interested. Parker got a meeting with the finance minister very quickly, and very quickly after that, they signed contracts. So within 2 weeks of him writing to the finance minister, the Ottoman government had agreed to the excavations, agreed to 2 contracts with the syndicate. And so these documents are from the original contracts between the Ottoman Empire and Parker. And again, some of the things you can see here, come over here. This was signed by the Ottoman finance minister, Zia Pasha. And Parker is listed as being an Englishman. It's in French because French at that time was the language of diplomacy. It says that he is domiciled at the Turf Club in Clarges Street in London. So he gave his address as his London club. So I guess the sort of people. But as you see, he was staying at the Pera Palace Hotel. And it was signed in November 1908. The amount of cooperation between the Ottoman Empire and the Parker expedition was very, very significant. In the contracts, the Ottoman government agreed to provide a military force, all military force necessary to safeguard the expedition and its members. And they provided that. They bound the Jerusalem governor to provide all means necessary. But they also then found, having signed all these, that actually it wasn't quite so easy because they had to buy the land in Jerusalem. And lots of people came forward saying, well, I own that bit of land, or I want all this money for that bit of land. And it took them a while. They had to go backwards and forwards and renegotiate, probably helped by some liberal amount of bribery, I'm afraid. They appointed an Armenian to help them. And in the reports that Parker wrote back to the investors, he said, he will help us with things that we can't write down. The British ambassador wrote at the time, he said that he believed that quite a number of people got very fat as a result of the expedition. And they certainly spent a lot of money just to buy the land and even stay at the Pera Palace Hotel. So the British ambassador in Constantinople, Sir Gerard Lowther, was not really a great fan of the expedition. So he wrote this after the calamitous sort of end of it. But anyway, he said that the whole business was a foolish exploit on the part of these young men who seemed to have more money than brains. The picture is of an Eton schoolboy because a very large number of the Englishmen, the British members of the expedition, were Eton educated. Who could have known that Etonians could mess things up? It would never happen today. And actually, in fact, one of the people who went on the expedition, who was an old Etonian, who went in 1909, couldn't go in 1910 because he was standing as a Conservative or Tory candidate in the elections of that year. Anyway, so this, back to the photo in terms of who the people are. Let me come over this side again. Just to list who they are. So this is Clarence Wilson. Initially, until I was researching it, he seemed a really completely minor figure in the expedition, but actually he was the one who provided the vast majority of the money. So he put in terms of today's money, £2.5 million to this expedition. And he also got his mother to invest in it, his brother, another brother to invest in it, and another brother to go on it. So the Wilson family were absolutely crucial to it, and without the Wilson family, this expedition would have fizzled out after 1909. His father had made an absolute fortune in Australia. At one point he owned 600,000 sheep in Australia, typically merino wool, and became one of the richest men ever in Australia, and that's how his fortune was made. Again, he was Eton educated, fought in the Boer War. I mentioned about the cooperation with the Ottoman government, and the Ottomans, to make sure that they weren't sort of tricked or cheated out of their money, appointed 2 commissioners to supervise the expedition and see that all was going to plan. So this one, Abdulaziz Mehdi Effendi, was an Ottoman parliamentarian and, as I say, appointed by the government. He was paid £100 a month for this, which was quite a lot of money, so he was very happy with this. He didn't have to do a lot, but he took part in this. Then Captain Cyril Ward, who was a Royal Navy officer, married to a rich Dutch baroness. At the time, his brother was the governor of Australia, had previously been a Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. So you get the sense these people were very much at the centre of British society. I mentioned about the Armenian translator and dracoman, Hagot Makazdar, probably Makazdarian, it should be, but he was very important in terms of the links, in terms of what happened and what they did in Jerusalem, because obviously these upper class Englishmen, British people, didn't really know how to act or what to do in Jerusalem. Then Colonel Cyril Foley, Eton educated again. You can see a trend here. His father was a general who had the joy of watching Cyril Foley's step great uncle lead the charge of the Light Brigade. So on the more positive side, in terms of the military history, one of his other ancestors led a manoeuvre at the Battle of the Nile, which destroyed Napoleon's fleet. He was a famous cricketer, played for Middlesex and the MCC, actually curiously had the nickname of the Raider because he took part in the Jameson Raid before the Boer War, which helped spark the Boer War. So his nickname was actually the Raider, again, fought in the Boer War. And then this is Montague Parker, generally known as Monty. This is the other Ottoman parliamentarian and commissioner, Habib Bey. And then this is Robin Duff, who was the son of a baronet, Eton educated, former officer in the Lifeguards, heir to a Welsh fortune made in slate, and very, very close to the British and German royal family. And then finally, and if I have time and don't overrun, because I sometimes do, this may be Kiyasam Iyas, and there is an amusing story about him involving Turkish delight, bearskins and strikers. And so if I have time, I'll tell the story. If not, maybe someone can ask me a question about it. So, were there any archaeologists on this expedition? Of course not. They had Juvelius's ciphers, but they wanted to have a backup plan. So what did they do? They got a crystal ball reader and psychic. They had a Swiss crystal ball reader called Otto von Borg, although he did go by various other names. And he made his name in a thing called the Foxwell case. It was a stockbroker who was travelling back from the city to his home in Thames Ditton and just disappeared. No one could find him, his wife couldn't. Complete mystery, and this became a very famous thing. His wife consulted psychics and he helped solve the case, which was Percy Foxwell was dead in the river Thames. But anyway. But he made a name for himself and was really very famous psychic at the time. Arthur Conan Doyle was very impressed, believed in his abilities, but anyway, he went along as the backup plan if the ciphers didn't work. They knew they were going to have to do some digging, so who would they have? They had a civil engineer, not an archaeologist, but a civil engineer. They engaged a person who was only ever known as Mr. Walsh from Pearson's Engineering, famous for a lot of tunnelling. They dug the Blackwall Tunnel, just a couple of miles, I guess, from here, tunnels under the Hudson River, the East River in New York, but again, not a lot of archaeological experience. Again, the unconventional approach in terms of going to Jerusalem, they went on Clarence Wilson's yacht, and that's how they sailed into Jaffa. This is called the Water Lily. He was a member of the Royal Yacht Squadron, and so they used his yacht to get there. They set themselves up as their offices in the Augusta Victoria Hospice, which had just been opened at the time, and stayed in the Hotel Fast, which Cyril Foley said was a very dirty hotel, the cleanest in Jerusalem. And then they started recruiting, and they recruited workers from the village of Silwan, just outside Jerusalem. And as I said, this was an enormous undertaking. They recruited 180 workers. They were operating 24 hours a day, a shift system, where the people worked 4 hours on, 4 hours off. And 180 workers, I mean, Felicity can comment perhaps on this, but at the time, I looked at Bliss and Dickey, one of theirs, they had 15 diggers. So 180 diggers. They had a whole load of other staff to look after them, cooks, cleaners, etc. But 180 diggers. So an absolutely phenomenal operation. They had a number of arguments and discussions amongst themselves about where to dig, because they had Juvelius' ciphers, but then they had the crystal ball reader who was telling everyone he knew exactly where it was. And then they had a guy called Per Tiotia, who was a friend of Juvelius, who said that actually the ark was on Mount Ararat. Well, I think he may have mistaken which ark he was talking about. But they started digging. They followed and went with Juvelius' ciphers and started digging in the Warren Shaft system and near the Gihon Spring. And this is a very important part of Jerusalem, because in a sense Jerusalem wouldn't be there without it. And so they started digging there. Mr. Walsh, the engineer, using the maps which were produced by the PEF, dug a shaft down into this tunnel system and straight into the tunnel system, which was a credit to the mapping abilities of Sir Charles Warren. And so they started digging there. And this here is a picture of the Virgin's Well, or the Gihon Spring. But they attracted a lot of attention in Jerusalem. It's a very small, relatively small city at the time. So you had 2 Ottoman parliamentarians, you had gendarmes guarding the site so no one could get in, you had the workers, the 180 people working throughout, 24 hours a day, and you had the upper class Englishmen themselves. And they attracted all sorts of attention because they tried to recreate their life back in England. So, of course, there weren't any pheasants to shoot in around Jerusalem, so they shot oranges, and they did target practice, and boys from the box colony, typically Yemeni Jewish boys, ran out to get the shattered oranges. They had races with their donkey boys, where they put the donkey boys on their the donkeys and that they used to get to the works, and they raced them with that. They had parties, so this was never going to be sort of low profile, and so people started saying, well, what are they doing? And the various members of the archaeological community in Jerusalem were raising concerns back to their offices in London or in Germany or in Paris or whatever, and various people, including Bertha Spafford-Vester, persuaded the expedition to actually appoint an archaeologist to help them. He didn't direct them, but he was to help them to document it. So they had a man called Father or Père Louis-Hugues Vincent, who was one of the most knowledgeable archaeologists on Jerusalem. He was a Dominican monk, came to Jerusalem in about 1890 something, and devoted the rest of his life to the study of archaeology in Jerusalem and in Palestine, the area. And afterwards produced a book of his work. And he did a fantastic job of documenting it, but he was not directing them. And there was always a certain amount of suspicion between the expedition and him, and it was never clear exactly how much he knew. At one level you think he must have known a certain amount, because lots of people seem to know what they were doing. But he never challenged Parker, and Parker never told him that. He was just allowed after the works to go in and document them. But he is one of the reasons why we have information, and he was very influential from a purely archaeological perspective in terms of this. So this is some of the documentation where you can see the Dominican friars in there. There was a photographer they had, Father Savignac, who took lots of photographs. They mapped all of this. And what the members of the expedition were doing around the Virgin's Well or the Gihon Spring, they believed, and Juvelius' ciphers said that there was a hidden entrance to a hiding place where the Ark and the temple treasures were. And they were underwater. The entrance to the hiding place was underwater, but the Ark and the temple treasures were safe above water. So they had to drain all these tunnels and clear all of these out. Now, these are thousands of years old, these tunnels. They were filled with the detritus of 2,500, 3,000 years. And also they were dug, and some of them are natural, all sorts of ways. So they found all sorts of dead ends like this. And they excavated and dug out all of these. And they spent several months in 1909 digging out all of these things, clearing them, and then off for Father Vincent to be able to document them. Finding nothing, unfortunately for them, other than they spent the equivalent of about £700,000, to find some pottery, some old Roman siege ammunition, and not a lot else, which wasn't quite the return the investors were looking for when they thought it was going to be worth tens of millions. They also dug in the shaft system that Captain Warren and Sergeant Birtles had climbed back when they were exploring it. Because again, Juvelius in the ciphers talked about a shaft system, which again the water was in, all these very vague things. But they dug out, they excavated, and they were, several members of the expedition were the first people to have climbed this since Captain Warren and Sergeant Birtles, which was quite an achievement. So Foley, Clarence Wilson, and Mr. Walsh were the ones who climbed this, using ladders that were only 7 feet long and strapping them all together. But towards the end of 1909, the weather turned bad, the rains, they damaged their works very significantly, so they all left, went home, but intending to come back in 1910 to restart. Not all of them came back though. So this is a picture of Juvelius, and he did the very touristy thing. There was a photographer called Khalil Rudd, who is near the Jaffa Gate, and he used to take pictures of the tourists. They would pose in local garb, and so obviously he decided to do that. But unfortunately he had a bit of a drink problem as well. And from information where Foley and Robin Duff met with Rudyard Kipling a couple of years later and said that unfortunately the Ottoman authorities had thrown him out because, I don't know whether it was a result of his drinking or whatever, but, and this is the quote, he would rape the local virgins. So he didn't come back to Jerusalem. He worked remotely and came up with lots more ciphers, which were, going to be very, very useful, of course. The other person who sort of came into this at the time, because as I say, they aroused lots of suspicion, and the members of the Jewish community were certainly becoming very suspicious and slightly fearful of what happened. Most of them thought this idea of them finding the Ark was absolutely madness. It was ridiculous. But there was that but. What if they actually did? And Edmond de Rothschild, who is a member of the French banking family, philanthropist, and a funder of Jewish colonies in Palestine at the time, decided he was going to do something about this. And so he decided he would buy land right next to the expedition, the Parker expedition, and he would obstruct them. He had them spied upon, but he wanted to make sure they didn't succeed. And if anyone was going to find it, he would. And he told the person, Chaim Weizmann, who became the first president of Israel, he didn't care about excavations. It was possession of the Ark that was the important thing. And I love this photograph. So this is a photograph, wonderfully Ottoman, late Ottoman, and the person in the picture is Albert Antebi, who was the agent for Baron de Rothschild. Very, very experienced. He was born in Damascus, I believe, and He bought up all the land next to, had a lot more success and a great deal of easier doing that. But according to various things, he also stole from the expedition, the Parker expedition, and worked to, if you like, make sure that they didn't succeed. So in 1910, what they decided to do, having started here and worked around the shaft system, was to clear out the entirety of the Tunnel of Siloam, or Hezekiah's Tunnel. This was dug famously at the time to try and preserve or make sure that the water supply of Jerusalem was in a secure place. The Bible says it was when Sennacherib was threatening Jerusalem, I believe. It probably took a lot more time than that. Walter reckoned it would take years to dig. And famously was dug from two ends, hence its slightly curving route. So originally they started with a team here, digging from here, and amazingly they met in the middle. And that's what the Parker expedition did as well. And so they spent weeks and weeks digging out the whole of this tunnel, clearing out several thousand years of detritus, and then allowing Father Vincent to document it.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
And at the end they had a ceremony to mark this, because actually there was a great purpose, well, there was a great value of this to the villagers in Silwan, because they used it for drinking water, for cooking water, for watering their crops. And so they had a grand ceremony to mark the opening of the tunnel. They had dammed the water, of course, because Warren famously almost drowned as he was going through these tunnels, but then they got them to the level. And they had a grand ceremony with the mayor down here. So they assembled a great group at the Pool of Siloam, fired a shotgun for a ganger here to blow up a dam holding the water back. It took a little longer for the ganger to blow up the dam. And then, of course, the water had to go through the hundreds of meters of the tunnel. The mayor got a little bored waiting for this and decided to walk into the tunnel. It was used to just a trickle of water coming through. But suddenly now it was clear, so he was hit with a sort of mini tsunami wave that swept him away, and he lost his hats, but no other harm was done. But again, they found nothing. They dug through this whole thing, expecting at some point they would find a hiding place, a door to a hiding place, but nothing. So, having spent 1909, 1910, spending a fortune, and with Clarence Wilson having to put in more and more money, they carried on working through the winter of 1910, 1911. At times the sewage system of Jerusalem, which was rather rudimentary, was overwhelmed, and the works were completely contaminated with sewage. But they carried on working, but they decided that in the end they were getting a little fed up of this. So they took a rather momentous decision. And one of the things that Juvelius in his ciphers said was that all of these chambers and tunnels were connected to the temple, where the first temple was, Solomon's temple, the first temple. And that there was the blood canal, which took blood away, sacrificial blood from the temple, because famously in the Bible it said when the temple was opened there were 140,000 animals that were sacrificed. So Juvelius believed that there was a canal which linked all this, and had said in his ciphers there were several openings into this from the temple. Of course, the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians first, and then obviously the second temple was destroyed by the Romans. So, but it was obviously on Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif. They believe that's where it was. And so they took the momentous decision to go and try and dig there. Now, of course, they couldn't just go up there and dig. They had to bribe some people to do that. The two Ottoman parliamentarians had left and gone back to Constantinople. They were bored, 2 years, nothing much had happened. And so the two Ottoman commissioners now were the governor of Jerusalem and the head of the gendarmes. And Parker was able to bribe them, and he also bribed the guardian of the Haram, Sheikh Khalil al-Ansari, allegedly with 100 gold sovereigns. And they were allowed to go and dig on Temple Mount, or in Haram al-Sharif, a noble sanctuary. I mean, there are lots of different names for this. So they were originally digging sort of down here, somewhere around here, Silwan. And the first area, they were staying at this point in the Augusta Victoria Hospice. First place they dug on the Haram was an area that's known as Solomon's Stables, which of course is nothing to do with Solomon, but anyway. But it's an underground area, and they spent several nights digging there because they dug at night. Obviously they couldn't just go and dig in this area. Even though they had bribed various people, it had to be done secretly. And I mentioned that they were staying at the Augusta Victoria Hospice. So they had workers from Silwan, they had gendarmes guarding the Haram so that no one could get in at night. And these upper-class Englishmen dressed up in local Arabic outfits went out at night, every night, to the Haram. And the German deaconesses at the Stiftung, or the Augusta Victoria, became a little suspicious of this. Well, where were these Englishmen going out dressed so strangely late at night, and challenged them that they had heard that they were going digging. He said, no, of course we're not. No, absolutely not. They found nothing in the area of Solomon's Stables, and so, don't know exactly how, but they got agreement to dig in the Dome of the Rock. If you want to try and find a more controversial, more delicate religious place in the world, I don't think you could find one. But they were able to dig in the Dome of the Rock in April of 1911, and they dug in there for at least 9 nights. And then finally, they were discovered. And one of the problems they had was not merely were they digging at the most controversial place, the most religiously sensitive place in the world, but they were doing it at probably the most religiously sensitive time when Jerusalem was absolutely packed. So it was Passover, it was the Ottoman Easter, it was the festival of Nabi Musa, all of which coincided at the time that year. So for the Ottoman Easter, there were thousands and thousands of Russian pilgrims who came to Jerusalem every year and filled up the city. And one of them, curiously, at that time was Rasputin. That year Rasputin was there. I'd love to write a sort of screenplay where you had Rasputin meeting Montague Parker. And, but anyway. But there were thousands and thousands of Christian pilgrims. There were thousands of Jews who come in for Passover. There were thousands and thousands of Muslims who come in from the surrounding areas. And many of those went on. There was a pilgrim, Nabi Musa. There was a pilgrimage out to a shrine near the Dead Sea. But Jerusalem was full. And one story is that one of the members of staff on the Haram couldn't sleep because his house was full, so decided to go and find a quieter place to sleep and went up to the Haram. Saw these people, heard noises, saw them with digging equipment, with carrying away soil, etc., and ran away screaming and raised the alarm. The other version is he wasn't bribed enough and so he gave them away. Take your pick, which one? I don't know. I honestly have no idea which one. But as a result, there was uproar in Jerusalem because imagine you're looking for fundamentally a Jewish object in the most sacred place for Islam at one of the most holy times for the Christian festival. I mean, it was just the worst possible thing. So there were riots and disorder. The Sheikh al-Ansari was attacked and his beard was shaved off, and he barely escaped with his life and had to be basically taken in protective custody. The Nabi Musa procession, one of the notables, gave a very fiery speech, and he wasn't noted as giving very fiery speeches, and they turned round and headed back to Jerusalem. There was a riot on the Haram al-Sharif, which started off with a minor disagreement between 2 vendors. The Nabi Musa procession, typically that was met by the governor of Jerusalem, who was the representative, obviously, of the Sultan. But they wanted to kill him, basically. And he was abused, he had to be protected, and just mass disorder in Jerusalem. But the expedition stayed for the moment and didn't flee immediately. But what it did was produce headlines around the world. So this is just a snapshot of a very few of the headlines around the world. And they were newspapers in the Ottoman Empire, in Europe, in UK, in Australia, in America. And this is the one I mentioned at the start. This is the letter from the Honorary Secretary of the PEF saying, we have absolutely nothing to do with this at all. And because this also happened at the time of the Young Turk Revolution, this was a very unstable time in the Ottoman Empire. And there were people who said it was a counter-revolutionary thing. But also various Europeans in Jerusalem reckoned that they were very happy that if the members of the expedition were tarred and feathered for their inconsiderately scattering sparks in this religious tinder heap, which I think is a very good description of Jerusalem at times. So the Ottoman government did keep a lid on the violence and the disorder, and they set up an official inquiry. And this is one of the reports of one of the investigators. So this is, anyone read? This is Ottoman Turkish, I think would be the best description of it. So it's an Arabic script, but it's Turkish. So this is a document from the investigation saying about the bribery. This was sold at Sotheby's a few years ago for, the estimate was between 20 and 30,000 pounds.
It's actually an Arabic.
Oh, it's Arabic, is it? Oh, sorry. All right.
I'm just reading it.
Anyway, but this was one of the documents of the investigation, and they took it very seriously. And there was a debate in the Ottoman Parliament about this, and so there were lots of things. And of course, the Ottoman government at the time had to say, well, the parliamentarians from Jerusalem attacked them and said, well, you knew all about this. You knew about the thing, and they had to admit, yes, well, they had signed contracts with Parker. And one of the slightly strange things was this got into a little part of the debate around Zionist Jewish immigration at the time, which was just beginning to bubble up in terms of the debate. And there was almost an argument from one Ottoman official that actually they would prefer it to have gone to Parker in terms of the Ark than someone else. But it was a very serious thing for the Ottoman Empire at the time. But in the end, they imprisoned a few local minor officials, but no one senior took any responsibility, which is a very classic government investigation. At this, everyone typically says the story ends because the idea is that they fled for their lives, but actually they didn't. The expedition didn't flee for their lives because they didn't leave Jerusalem and flee back to England. They went to Constantinople. And they went to Constantinople because they believed that they were very close to finding the Ark. And they went to Constantinople to make sure they could go back to Jerusalem. And originally, they went back to Jerusalem. So this boat here, I mentioned about the Water Lily, which was one of Clarence Wilson's boats. He bought another bigger one that year, so they could go back. This is called the Dorothy. So this is one of Clarence Wilson's. And they sailed back from Monte Carlo to Jaffa in September 1911. Unfortunately, the timing was slightly off because sailing across the Mediterranean at the time was also an Italian fleet to attack what is now Libya, what became the Italo-Turkish War of 1911. And there was still a lot of uncertainty in Jerusalem, and they were not allowed to go back to Jerusalem. But they believed they were going to be able to, but they got stuck in Egypt at the time. Parker a little bit shuttling backwards and forwards between Constantinople and Egypt. But whilst he was a bit bored in Egypt, he decided to do a bit of gun running. There was a war going on, so why let a good opportunity go to waste? So he used Clarence Wilson's yacht, which was flying the flag of the Royal Yacht Squadron, so what better thing to get through the Italian Navy than something flying the Royal Yacht Squadron pennant? And he ran guns for the Ottoman Empire into Libya. British ambassador at the time was horrified. He wrote lots of messages back to Whitehall and to the foreign minister, etc., saying this was a scandal and how dare it, and he really didn't like Parker at all. But the persistence was about to pay off, and in Christmas of 1912, the Ottoman government, both locally in Jerusalem and in Constantinople, agreed that they could go back. But I mentioned about the curse. Was there a curse? I don't believe in curses. But many of the people who went on the expedition did come to rather sticky fates. Now, some of this you can just say is the First World War. But for me, probably the most important person in the expedition was Clarence Wilson, organisationally and the money. Without him, it could have gone no further. And he was in Egypt in 1912 when he went out of his mind and had to be brought back. And in early 1913, there was an order in lunacy granted at the High Court in London because he had a very substantial estate and his family didn't want the money being spent on other things, so that the taps were turned off in terms of the money. And he was of unsound mind for the rest of his life. Then Parker had lost interest by this point. He was travelling in America, etc. I think he was bored by the whole thing. The First World War broke out. Obviously, the Ottoman Empire was on the other side to the British, and quite a few members of the expedition were killed during the First World War. So Robin Duff rejoined the Lifeguards, was killed near Ypres in late 1914. Gordon Wilson, who was there in 1911, was killed also near Ypres in 1914, only a few weeks apart. Herbert Wilson, the brother of Clarence and Gordon, who was an investor in the expedition, was killed in Arras in 1917. Otto von Borg, who was actually there for all 3 years of the excavations, and also 1912 in Egypt. He spent all that time there. They were paying him all this time. He almost went off. He persuaded some Americans that he could find treasure on the island of Cocos off the Costa Rican coast. There's lots of treasure that's buried there, and because he had done such a fantastic job in Jerusalem, he was going to help them do that as well. He got deported from Britain in 1917. The person who started it, Walter Juvelius, died of cancer in 1922. And then Cyril Ward, the man who stood as conservative, he was a gambler. Perhaps that was also why he was on the expedition as well. He was declared bankrupt in 1923. He had lost a fortune. He had inherited £100,000 in 1895 from his father. £100,000 in those days was obviously an awful lot of money. He'd gambled it all away. So I don't believe in curses, but it's rather strange. And you may say, well, a lot of them are just the First World War, and many people did die in the First World War. But obviously, Clarence Wilson went mad. Perhaps this whole thing drove him mad. The idea he was writing letters raving about ananas and the Masons and things, and he just went mad. So, archaeological is an archaeological thing. So there were some, and mostly thanks to Father Vincent, and also the money that they spent on it, because they spent an absolute fortune. They spent, in today's terms, over £5 million on all their work. They found very early Bronze Age work, and all of this is documented in some books that Father Vincent produced with the help of Parker, but obviously written by Father Vincent. Although they were still somewhat suspicious of how they could describe themselves, because Vincent didn't name himself as the author, he just said HV. And he only referred to Parker and the other members as he gave them MA, MB, Maître this and Maître B, etc. They were never referred to by name. But one of the things he found, and obviously the expedition was not interested in at all, was some very early, and the earliest burial remains in the tunnel and shaft system. And so, I'm not an archaeologist, but from what I've read, this settled the argument about where the original Jebusite city was, and therefore where the original Jewish city of David was. He wasn't the first person, because originally they thought that it was on Mount Zion, which was on the other side of Jerusalem. But increasingly the opinion had been that it was on this side, it was linked with the Gihon Spring. And it's my understanding, but that this settled the argument. These burial sites were the oldest that had been found. They also found the throne of Solomon. When they were digging, the workers had triumphantly found a quarry, and they thought they had found the throne of Solomon. But Father Vincent had to disabuse them of this and said that it was for a much more private and personal usage. But it was the first Iron Age toilet that was found in Jerusalem. And actually there's been an article written recently in the PEQ about it by an American professor, because there have been very few of these found, and they're quite important. But they found the first one.
That's a good name
The
for it.
clearance of the Siloam tunnel and the documentation of that, I think, is probably archaeologically their greatest achievement. Because they had the money. They put the money into doing this, and no one else could do that. So, the question is, was it just a ridiculous, stupid adventure? Of course it was, but has it actually had any longer term impact? And I tread very carefully because this is a very careful, sensitive area. But one of them is an American professor who's written about this, who said at the time, and the fact that they were digging on Haram al-Sharif Temple Mount, the religious sensitivities of that, at a time of sort of declining confidence in the Ottoman Empire, at a time of increasing Jewish immigration into Palestine, that it helped. And there are way more important events that have happened in Jerusalem, etc., than the Parker expedition. I don't want to overemphasize this, but it was one of the first things that there was a stirring sense of Palestine nationalism, and that they couldn't rely on the Ottoman Empire to protect the holy spaces and holy places there, and that sense of Palestinian nationalism centered around the Haram al-Sharif. It was one of the very first things that stirred that. I'd say no more than that. The other one is that the areas that they dug in are now the City of David Archaeological Park, as you see here, where it all began. You can walk through these. These are now one of the prime tourist attractions in Jerusalem. And the City of David Archaeological Park is run by an organization called Elad, which is somewhat controversial even in Israel in terms of its objectives. But they've put an absolute fortune into this in the same way as the Parker expedition did in their searches. And ironically, it's come out that one of the people who's provided the most funding to Elad was Roman Abramovich. So you had someone who was in the UK at the time, who'd made his fortune somewhere else, who loved large yachts and large boats. Clarence Wilson, Roman Abramovich. Seems to go with the place. So, on that, in terms of, who pays for archaeological work, I'll leave you with this Professor Ronnie Reich, who dug through these, which is, there are all sorts of reasons why people dig and do archaeology in places like the Holy Land. And often their reasons, there are lots of reasons why they do this. So anyway, I'll leave you as my final thought there. If you're interested, this is my book. There are actually quite a few others. When I started this, I thought, I was the only one writing about it. There are lots of books about this. Bizarrely, there was an American author who's written a sort of imagined, conversations and things in terms of an account of it. There is a Finnish academic who's written a book from the, if you like, Finnish side, from Juvelius. There's an Israeli author who's written an imagined side there. There's Professor Louis Fishman who's written a book about the late Ottoman Palestine. So there are actually quite a lot of books about it, but anyway. So, Any questions? I've overrun, but anyway.
Well, thank you very, very much, Graham. That was fascinating. I urge all of you to go and buy that book and read it, because it is fantastic. It really is just one of the most interesting and fascinating books I've read on Jerusalem in a very long time. So, does anyone have any questions? Yes.
Could I ask, what do you think would have happened if they had found it?
Well, according to Foley, they were going to sell it. They were in it for the money. So Foley said that he believed that, you know, the 50-50 split, the people who were in the expedition would get £20 million, and he was going to buy a Channel Island as a result of that, with his share of the money. So Foley, who wrote a book about, he had a chapter in it about the expedition. He believed that the Jewish community, in the book he says something like, I couldn't imagine there was any member of the Jewish community who wouldn't subscribe to help buy it. So they were going to sell it. They were going to make the money. It was purely for that.
Gosh, where to begin? Paul.
So it was very interesting that they went into the Warren tunnels and stuff. What was Warren's take on this? And
he was scandalised. He was scandalised actually by Vincent's description. So there was a debate in the PEQ after this all happened, because Vincent produced the book, and Warren thought that Vincent had sort of dismissed all the work that Warren had done and the value of all the things, and basically said, look, all the things that Warren had found, he just sort of gave his name to. And so there was a backwards and forwards between Warren and Vincent, and in the end they settled it, and they shook hands, you know, at least in letter form, and said, well, we all think that we're good archaeologists, and you know.
Ray.
Well, surely one of the major legacies is all of a sudden the interest in the Ark of the Covenant, which not only spawned books around this one,
Yes.
but subsequent, Hancock's books. I mean,
Oh yes.
along with the Holy Grail,
Yes.
the Ark of the Covenant
I
has
know.
been the X marks the
Yes.
spawn treasure.
And I believe that this was the first
Yeah.
search for
Yeah.
it, and so I think Steven Spielberg probably owes a
Correct.
lot of royalties to them as well. Yes. But yeah, don't get me started on some of the crazy theories about where the Ark is or isn't. I mean, Ethiopia, some place in the Midlands in the UK, in Chartres Cathedral. I mean, it's everywhere. It's Oak Island in Canada. Everyone has a story of where it is. I mean, most likely it was destroyed by the Babylonians. The other alternative, if it was stored somewhere, it was a wooden box. Sure, it was covered in gold and things, but it was a wooden box. And unless you believe in the magical, properties of it, it would never have survived in Jerusalem for thousands of years. It would have just rotted away.
It's built up around it,
Oh, totally.
in terms of long life and all the other things that are assumed around the Ark of the Covenant.
Yes, curiously, long life. I always think the Ark is it killed people.
That's biblical.
Yes, the biblical one, but there is no other source on the Ark than the Bible.
But I think it did translate to that, in touch with eternity.
Yes,
God.
yes. It was because it was the place where God, according to the Bible,
Yeah.
the mercy seat was where God was present on earth
Yeah.
until the Babylonians came and then God left.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Ethiopia, and that was my area of studies, and to this day there are 100 million Ethiopians that believe it resides at the Church of St Mary of Zion, with a special shrine and so on.
Yeah.
I'm amazed that the Parker didn't exclude this as a sort of possibility that it might be there, because a lot of people might have thought it would have been.
I don't know whether they considered it. Who knows? As you say, it is an article of faith for the Ethiopian church that it is there. Even though to believe it is there, you have to believe in a book that was written 2,000 years after the event that it was describing. And so, it's so unlikely that it is there. And what I've read, and I know the Graham Hancock stories and all that, and yes, of course it is there, even though you have to get through an enormous, these long set of improbable coincidences that it actually was there. But, you know, I'm an old cynic perhaps.
It was more of a comment. You printed the letter from Crace saying at the end, we are not treasure hunters. It's quite interesting that even then they had to make that point, which had been made ever since. You know? But when you see popular interest in archaeology, it's still the treasure that people want to look at.
I'm afraid
it's
I wrote
a hoard.
about it,
Yeah.
but yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It is, because it's probably a little, you know, some pottery.
Yeah.
So that pottery that was found is in the Rockefeller Museum, or some of it is in the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem. Very few people go and visit it.
Yeah.
Imagine if the Ark of the Covenant was there. It would be
Yes, everybody would be at it. Nick?
Yes, these upper class Englishmen, were they Freemasons?
Ah, the Masons. Some of them, yes.
Yeah.
They had a strange view of the Masons. They were both fearful of the Masons, but Cyril Ward, who was the one who stood as a Tory MP, he was a Mason. Later in life, and Juvelius became a Mason, and one of the others, who I can't remember, who also became a Masons, but they weren't predominantly Masons, no. At least to my knowledge. The only one I know about is Ward, definitely of the British ones.
Any other questions? Bob?
Did they also excavate on the top of the city of David? Above the
No, they really concentrated underneath. So they tended to just either go in at the Gihon Spring, the Virgin's Well, or vertical shots. A bit like Warren did. He, for all sorts of reasons, largely dug underground.
Did. That's right, yes. We don't recommend it, as either archaeologically or for health reasons and all sorts of things. And yes.
You mentioned about the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. I was wondering a bit of the wider sort of political kind of context as seeing them as, I can't remember exactly what the phrase was, but not
more money than brains.
Right, that's it. I suppose at that time, British foreign policy, the Ottoman Empire, who in British official terms was seen as the sick man of Europe, and Britain wanted to sort of almost like prop it up, obviously up until the First World War, or prevent any rival European power benefiting from the sort of the slow sinking. I wonder if I suppose it comes into the thing about these were rich Newtonians with connections and money.
Yes.
But how the sort of British establishment saw them, did they see any benefit, or was it simply something they couldn't stop them from doing because they had these connections and this money?
I'll give a plug to my book. There's a bit more in my book about this, and because it's a longer explanation, because one of the things about this, when it all sort of kicked off in 1911, was that the British Empire ruled 100 million Muslims, largely in India, but all sorts of other places, where the British Empire was. And they were horrified by this, and there was actually a delegation from India which was sent to investigate in Jerusalem of what was done of these, British, English upper class men, because they didn't want to stir any emotions amongst the Muslim population of the British Empire, which was, as I say, 100 million, which is enormous. And obviously Britain wasn't part of the empire, but they ruled Egypt. And so they were, as I say, there's a longer bit in the book about it. There was then also the rivalry between Britain and Germany, and the German Kaiser Wilhelm was making a real play for the Ottoman Empire and also trying to cause problems for the British Empire with its Muslim population. So they were largely horrified by this.
Thank you.
You were possibly going to tell us a story about the young boy.
Oh, yes. Thank you very much for reminding me. I think it's an amusing one. So, one of the things about them, again, crazy upper-class Englishmen. So, Duff was an officer in the Lifeguards. Their uniform, as of today, was very, very similar, largely. So he took his uniform, metal helmet, cuirass, long leather boots, gauntlets, and he took all that Parker was an officer in the Grenadier Guards, took his bearskin, his scarlet tunic, and one day they were going to meet the mayor, and they were told, well, best to wear a uniform if you got. So they got dressed up in all their uniform. But also, it was a day when there was a strike, and the strikers, they paid them piece rate or piecework. And one team who, I know I get too long, but there was a strike, and the strikers were taken to court and were sent to prison by the judge. Well, I don't know whether it was a judge, but whoever was presiding in court. But Parker, in his Grenadier Guards uniform, stood up to give a speech in defence of them, which seems strange, they're strikers against, but anyway, he made such a good speech to the person presiding in court that they were freed. So of course, that was brilliant. And the mayor said, well, I want to go down and see these works of yours. And they decided, and the reason this is a picture of one of the streets in the old Jewish quarter. They decided to ride down through the old Jewish quarter, narrow streets. They had at the front of them a whole series of Turkish lancers. They had the mayor on a beautiful Arabian steed, and you had the expedition here, Duff, on his donkey, his white donkey, and he was over 6 foot tall. It was a white donkey. Its mane was painted yellow, its tail was painted yellow, his feet were almost scraping along the ground, but he's dressed in his lifeguard's uniform. Anyway, they were going down to the Jewish quarter, and it was so crammed and so packed, it was very hard for them to get through. And then Kiasam Iyas, if he was the one in that picture, but he was one of the donkey boys, was getting fed up with it being a bit too slow. So he gave the mayor's horse a whack on the backside, which he shot forward and spooked Robin Duff's donkey, which shied anyway, deposited him into a shop in the quarter, which sold peanuts and Turkish delight. So he emerged from this shop covered in sticky Turkish delight with his metal helmet full of peanuts, his gauntlets full of peanuts. And they had to get him back on his horse and things, but he was stuck with the Turkish delight because of Kiasam Iyas, who's probably the only, if you like, let's call ordinary person who is listed in this.
I have a question actually about how did the locals deal and get on with, or not with these people, and what do they make of them?
They got on very well, and I have to say, I make light of these ridiculous upper class Englishmen. They were a great boon to the village of Silwan. They treated the villagers very well. They employed them. They also, in times during the winter, had soup kitchens for the villagers. There weren't any accidents where anyone was injured or killed in all of the workings, and they were quite dangerous conditions. So they liked them.
Okay.
Especially the villagers in Silwan. And obviously it was just, it's a poor area, and so they were really quite popular.
Until they went on the Temple Mount and Hamal.
Yes. But even then the mayor still came to see them in London, wanting some money off them. He said they were owed money by them, but it was still very popular.
And I suppose they cleared out their water system, didn't
Exactly. So that benefit, these areas were largely in those days, they were agricultural, so lots of cabbages and things like that were grown on these slopes, and they used that water for that purpose. And so yes, it was a tremendous boon to that area.
Very interesting. Any more questions? Well, in that case, I think it's time to say thank you so much, Graham, for a fascinating talk. I've been looking forward to this for a very long time, and it hasn't disappointed. Will you join me now in giving...